Welcome back to Outlaw Operations. Tonight, we're diving into a chilling case filled with deception, greed, and betrayal. A story that seemed to be about love and ambition but ended in tragedy. Before we get into it, take a second to drop a comment. Where are you listening from? And if you enjoy true crime storytelling, hit that like button and subscribe. Now, let's settle in and get started. Sahil had been planning this for months. Each envelope, containing fragments of his wife Priya's dismembered body, was carefully sealed and placed into the deep freezer. The smell of decay was something he couldn't afford to let spread, so he kept each piece cold, waiting for the right moment to dispose of them. It hadn't been easy. The murder itself, the dismemberment, and the grisly task of hiding her body, all took days. But Sahil was patient, determined to keep his horrific secret buried. For days, he dodged calls from Priya's family, her parents and younger brother, Aryan. Every time they called, Sahil had a new excuse, a new lie. He told them that Priya had gone on a business trip to Delhi, or that she was visiting a friend in the city. When neighbors started asking questions, wondering why Priya had suddenly disappeared, Sahil spun the same tales. He even went as far as to pretend he was communicating with her through email, using Priya's account to send messages to her family, keeping up the illusion that she was alive and well. In truth, she was no longer even a memory, just a pile of fragments locked away in the freezer. But Sahil didn't stop there. Once he had finished his grim work, he took his twin children, Arav and Mira, on a trip, a family getaway, he called it. They drove to the quiet hill station of Nainital in Uttarakhand, a peaceful retreat far from the prying eyes of the city. What Sahil didn't say was that this trip wasn't just for sightseeing. He had a plan to dispose of the evidence once and for all. Every day, he would take one or two of the envelopes containing Priya's remains from the freezer and, while driving through the mountains, would toss them into the forests or into the deep gorges along the way. He was trying to erase all traces of what he had done. But his carefully constructed web of lies began to unravel. As the days passed and Priya's family grew more concerned, they finally went to the authorities. Sahil was questioned, but his lies were starting to catch up with him. The police launched a search and found black envelopes scattered around the areas where Sahil had claimed to have discarded the remains. The forest, the gorge, all were filled with grim evidence of his crime. It wasn't long before the police arrested Sahil, and the full extent of his brutality was revealed. Meanwhile, his children, Arav and Mira, were sent to stay with Priya's brother, Aryan, in Delhi. The courts quickly granted full custody of the children to Aryan, as it was clear that Sahil was no longer fit to care for them. He had destroyed their mother and shattered their lives. On March 7, 2011, the court made the decision official, but Sahil's father, Ram Singh, wasn't ready to let go. He filed an appeal, hoping to reverse the custody decision, but in November 2012, the court rejected Ram Singh's appeal and upheld Aryan's custody of the children. As the trial dragged on, more horrifying details came to light. Sahil had not only murdered Priya but had dismembered her body into 72 pieces. Each piece was disposed of in a different location, scattered like a twisted puzzle he had hoped would never be put back together. The trial lasted 7 grueling years, with evidence mounting against him. Finally, on September 1, 2017, Sahil was sentenced to life imprisonment. Along with the sentence, he was ordered to pay a fine of 1.5 million rupees. Of that amount, 70,000 rupees was to be deposited into the state treasury, while the remaining sum would be set aside for Arav and Mira. The money would be placed in their names and could only be accessed once they reached adulthood. Even as he sat in jail, waiting out his sentence, Sahil appealed the decision, hoping to overturn the court's ruling. His appeal, filed in 2018, has yet to be decided. But the damage had already been done. His confession during police interrogation revealed more than just the murder. He disclosed that he had a daughter from a second marriage, a fact that shed light on the financial strain and emotional bitterness that had plagued his relationship with Priya. It became clear that, for years, Sahil had been trying to escape his responsibilities, both as a husband and as a father. The violence, The rage, and the murder had been the tragic culmination of his attempts to break free from the burdens he couldn't carry. This case shocked the country, not just for the brutality of the crime but for the cold, calculated way Sahil had gone about hiding the evidence. He had betrayed not just his wife, but his children, his family, and every person who trusted him. Priya's family, devastated by the loss, now had to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, while Arif and Meera were forced to grow up without the parents they once knew. But the question remained, could any of this have been avoided? Could Sahil's descent into violence have been stopped before it reached its horrific climax? Perhaps if those around him had recognized the signs of his unraveling mind, things might have turned out differently. But as the pieces fell into place, the truth was inescapable. Sahil had chosen his path, and the consequences would haunt him for the rest of his life. Emily sat in the interview room with an unnerving calm, her posture relaxed as if this was all just another day. She was the first to speak after the murder of David, her ex-husband, and her behavior stood in stark contrast to the chaos surrounding his death. They had shared a life together, years of memories and a young daughter. But instead of grief, there was only a chilling composure, like she was detached from the entire tragedy. She spoke about David in a way that made him sound like a ticking time bomb, a man who had always been troubled, always teetering on the edge. But the details she provided were strange. There was a coldness to her words, almost like she was trying to paint a darker picture of him, to make people believe that his death was inevitable, even deserved. She claimed to know who was behind his murder. She said it all started with a motorcycle gang in Montana. David, she explained, had been mixed up with dangerous people. One day, a gang member had showed up at his mother's house and threatened to kill him. Some of the story checked out. The gang had been real, though the details seemed more exaggerated the deeper they dug. The threat itself? Real enough, but it was an empty promise. The gang had simply faded into the background when a motorcycle broke down, leaving nothing but a bizarre trail of half-truths and a mess of confusion. Emily's story didn't match up with the bigger picture, but it was convincing enough at first. When the detectives asked her where she was on the morning of the murder, Emily stuck to her story. She was at the grocery store, a few miles away from the church where David had been found. She was there with her father, Charles, and her alibi was confirmed by the store's surveillance footage at exactly 10:57 a.m. Charles gave the same version of events, his recollection identical to hers. But Charles was a man with a reputation. He had never made any effort to hide his disdain for David. He openly hated him, and it wasn't just the occasional harsh word, it was a deep-rooted animosity that simmered beneath every interaction. Investigators were suspicious of his lack of reaction to David's death. He didn't seem devastated. He seemed indifferent. They tested Charles's hands for traces of gunpowder. Nothing. No evidence of direct involvement. But something still didn't sit right with them. His apathy, the way he carried himself, it all seemed off. As the investigation deepened, the team uncovered something even darker, the custody battle between David and Emily over their 5-year-old daughter, Lucy. The court drama had been escalating for months, with both sides pulling every trick to win custody. And it seemed David was on the verge of gaining sole custody. Emily's family, especially her father, Charles, had done everything to keep Lucy from David's grasp. The tension was palpable. It was no longer just a legal battle, it was personal, vicious, and filled with desperation. David wanted to be the one to raise his daughter, but Emily and her family had no intention of letting that happen. The courts, however, were leaning in David's favor, and that prospect terrified Emily's family. The possibility of losing Lucy to her father was too much to bear. And so, they made a decision. If they couldn't win in court, they would remove David permanently. Investigators began to look into Emily's background. What they found shocked them. In 2013, she had been arrested for possession of illegal substances. Not once, but multiple times. Her criminal history wasn't a secret, and it didn't help her case. When Emily had been incarcerated, her parents, Charles and Claire, had been granted temporary custody of Lucy. They kept her from David, refusing to allow him any contact with his daughter. Despite this, Emily continued to live with her daughter in the house, even after the court orders told her she wasn't supposed to. She slept in the same bed as Lucy, breaking every rule set by Child Protective Services. In early 2014, another search was conducted at the Westbrook home. What they found inside was damning. A syringe with traces of illegal drugs. A gun, carelessly left on the nightstand beside Emily's bed. It was a dangerous combination, an unsafe environment for a child. By March 2014, barely 2 months after David's death, authorities decided enough was enough. Lucy was taken into temporary custody, and Emily, her brother, Daniel, and their parents, Charles and Claire, were all arrested. The charges weren't about murder yet. They didn't have the evidence linking them to David's death, but the situation was escalating. Something had to give. The police interrogated the family, but they couldn't crack them, not at first. Charles and Claire maintained their composure. Emily stuck to her story, unwavering. Daniel, however, was different. At just 18 years old, he was younger, more vulnerable. He hadn't lived with the same bitterness and rage that his family had. The detectives used pressure tactics on Daniel, playing on his fears. They told him that if they were convicted, his entire family would be facing life in prison. And the ones responsible for David's death? They would be sentenced to death. Daniel, overwhelmed with fear for his family, broke. He confessed. The truth spilled out in a rush. It wasn't a random act of violence. It wasn't a tragic accident. The murder had been planned. Emily and her family had meticulously plotted to kill David in order to keep Lucy away from him. The custody battle had driven them to this. They knew David was about to win, and they couldn't bear to let him have his daughter. The morning of the murder had been carefully coordinated. David's routine was familiar to them, he was predictable, easy to track. They knew exactly where he'd be, where he'd park, and where he'd be most vulnerable. 2 shooters, 1 getaway vehicle, and a plan to eliminate David once and for all. The execution was quick, clinical. There was no hesitation, no mercy. David never saw it coming. He and his new partner were gunned down in the church parking lot, their lives taken in an instant, as if they never mattered. The investigation that followed pieced the rest of the story together. Emily had wanted control over Lucy, and her family had been willing to do anything to keep it that way. The coldness in Emily's demeanor, her refusal to show grief, the way she treated David like a non-factor, it all made sense now. She had been so certain that removing him from their lives was the only way. And it cost him his life. But the real horror? The way her daughter had been caught in the middle of it all. Lucy had been living under the same roof as the woman who had orchestrated her father's murder. The home that was supposed to protect her had become the very place she needed to escape from. It was a family's betrayal, a twisted plan, and a young girl's life forever changed. And though the Westbrook family thought they had won, the consequences of their actions would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Kara couldn't bear it anymore. Her ex-husband, Marcus, had rebuilt his life. He had moved on, new wife, a stable home, and worse still, he was getting more time with their daughter. The court had granted him several visitations, and that's when it hit her, Marcus was winning. He was getting everything he wanted. And Kara? She was losing control. The more she thought about it, the more desperate she became. The idea of Marcus having unrestricted access to their daughter was unthinkable to her. It wasn't just about custody, it was about dominance. About proving she could be the one in charge, no matter the cost. At first, Kara tried to find someone who could make Marcus disappear, for good. She had thought about hiring a hitman, but the plan failed. She couldn't get it together. That's when she turned to her family. They were the only ones she trusted to pull off something like this. They were the only ones who would help her with her sick, twisted idea. Kara's father, Victor, was the first to agree. He had always been protective of her, perhaps too much so, and he'd never question her. Her mother, Sylvia, would play the role of the lookout. And her younger brother, Jake, would help with the cleanup. The entire family had their part to play. The plan was simple, if not terrifying. It would all happen on January 18th. The day started like any other Sunday. They all attended church, making sure to be seen by anyone who might take notice. But the church was just the backdrop. It was a place of normalcy, of routine. The calm before the storm. Kara's ex-husband Marcus and his wife, Rachel, showed up at the church with little Olivia in tow. After the service, Marcus was supposed to take Olivia for his scheduled visitation. Kara's time had come. She would not let him have this. Kara and Victor arrived at a small convenience store, acting like customers. They needed to establish an alibi. They bought a few things, laughed a little too loudly, lingered just enough for the cameras to catch them. They had to make sure it looked like they were miles away from the church when the crime happened. They didn't anticipate the slip-up in timing. While they were faking normalcy in the store, Sylvia stayed at the church. She kept an eye on Marcus and Rachel as they prepared to leave. With her phone in hand, she updated the others on their movements, letting them know exactly when they would be walking out of the building. She texted Kara, who was already making her move. "Ready when you are," Sylvia's message read. That text would be one of the last pieces of evidence that linked her to the crime. Once Marcus and Rachel were leaving, Kara and Victor made their move. They followed them, keeping their distance until they reached a stretch of remote road. There, near a desolate, old church, they ambushed them. Marcus and Rachel didn't even have time to react. One shot to the head for each of them, clean and final. Jake's role was to dispose of the evidence. After the murder, he took the gun, cleaned it, and drove it out to a lake. He dumped the weapon in the water, thinking it would sink and be forgotten forever. But nothing stays buried forever. The investigation didn't take long to catch up with the family. It was Jake who eventually cracked under pressure. He confessed to everything, to his involvement, and to the roles his family played. He showed the police the exact location where he had disposed of the murder weapon. Divers retrieved the gun, and all the pieces started to fall into place. Kara, Victor, Sylvia, and Jake were arrested. Kara and Victor had pulled the trigger. Sylvia and Jake had played their parts in the scheme. Sylvia had been at the church, keeping watch, and Jake had done the dirty work of disposing of the evidence. Even though Sylvia hadn't directly killed anyone, the evidence was clear, she had helped orchestrate it. One by one, the family members faced trial. Victor's defense was that he was mentally unfit for trial. He had been showing signs of seizure-like behavior, and his defense argued he wasn't capable of understanding what he had done. For a time, it seemed like it would work. A judge found him mentally incompetent, but that verdict was overturned a few months later. Faced with the death penalty, Victor took a plea deal. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Sylvia, on the other hand, pled guilty to participating in organized criminal activity. She avoided the death penalty but wouldn't see freedom until 2046. Jake, the youngest of them all, took a different approach. He pled guilty to tampering with evidence and agreed to testify against his family. While he didn't pull the trigger, his role in the crime was undeniable. The investigators weren't sure if Jake knew more than he was letting on. He lived in the house. He knew the plans. He couldn't have been oblivious. Kara was the last to stand trial. She adamantly denied any wrongdoing. She claimed that her entire family was crazy, and that she was the only one who hadn't lost her mind. But as her father, mother, and brother all testified against her, it became clear that Kara had masterminded the entire thing. Each witness took the stand and pointed their finger at her, accusing her of being the driving force behind the murder. The trial was long, grueling, and full of raw emotion. Kara tried to hold on to her innocence, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for hours, but it wasn't enough to sway their decision. After just 8 hours, they found her guilty of capital murder. Kara was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the months that followed, the entire family unraveled. Victor and Sylvia were both locked away, serving their sentences. Kara found herself behind bars at the Texas Women's Prison, while Jake served time for his involvement in the crime. The family that had once been so close had now been torn apart by their own actions. The community, stunned and shaken, struggled to understand how it had come to this. How had a family, seemingly normal, turned into a machine of death and deceit? The answers were chilling. The true cost of their actions could never be undone. What started as a bitter custody battle had turned into a blood-soaked tragedy. Kara had wanted control, and she had gotten it, but at a steep price. 2 innocent people were dead, and a family was forever shattered by the choices they had made. There was no going back. Now, as the years pass, the names of Kara, Victor, Sylvia, and Jake Westfield remain synonymous with one of the darkest and most twisted family crimes in recent memory. The question remains, how far would you go to get what you want? Would you sacrifice everything for a single moment of victory? For the Westfields, the answer had already been written in blood. It was a regular Tuesday afternoon at Central Station, the bustle of the city filling the air. People rushed to catch their trains, some in a hurry, others leisurely strolling through the busy terminal. Among the crowd was Emma Davis, who was supposed to meet a friend after her day at the office. The clock struck 4:30 p.m., and then she was simply gone. Just like that. No one saw her leave. No one saw where she went. 2 days passed. On the second evening, Emma's husband, Simon Webb, made his way to the station to pick up his wife, who had just returned from a work trip. He smiled as he saw her, but before he could say anything, her aunt, Kate, pulled him aside, asking, "Have you heard from Emma? Where is she?" Simon paused for a moment, his smile fading. "I haven't seen her in 2 days," he said, shrugging. "I've been up late most nights, and I sleep in." I didn't think anything of it. But Kate knew something wasn't right. Emma was never the type to disappear without a word. Something about the silence gnawed at her. She tried calling Emma's phone, but it went straight to voicemail every time. It had been off. No messages. No calls. Nothing. Kate grew frantic. She reached out to Emma's friends, her co-workers, anyone who might know where she was. But no one had seen her. No one knew. She checked Emma's apartment. Everything was in place. Emma's things were neatly arranged, her desk spotless. But there was one thing missing, her laptop. It was turned off, no new activity. It looked like Emma had just stepped out, maybe for a few minutes, but then, nothing. Emma was always in contact with her friends, especially those abroad. She had family in the UK and Australia, and they all kept in touch frequently. Her sudden silence was uncharacteristic, and it raised alarm bells in Kate's mind. Something had happened to her. Something terrible. The next morning, Kate, along with Simon, went to the police station. They filed a missing persons report. It was April 24, 2016. The search began. That same day, on a secluded stretch of coastline called Seaview Point, a group of tourists made a horrifying discovery. A woman's body was found, wrapped in plastic, discarded by the water like a piece of garbage. The scene was both eerie and tragic, set against the serene beauty of the coast. As the search for Emma continued, the news broke about the discovery. The authorities began showing a sketch of the body, and soon enough, the details matched Emma perfectly. Her family, still holding on to hope, now faced the grim reality that their beloved Emma was gone. Her body had been found. The police worked quickly to confirm her identity. It took them 3 days, but when they finally did, Emma was no longer a missing person, she was a victim of a brutal crime. An investigation was launched. The detectives turned their focus to Emma's inner circle. Simon, her husband, became a central figure. He had been the last person to see her alive. But his story seemed off. Simon had been known for staying up late, often working on his computer, barely waking before the afternoon light filled their apartment. His alibi seemed weak, but could he really have been unaware of his wife's absence for 2 days? The police dug deeper into his movements. They examined the footage from the train station. CCTV showed Emma walking alone that afternoon. No one in sight. No one beside her. The theory of an unknown attacker who had been watching her seemed plausible, but something didn't sit right. There was no evidence that Emma had planned to meet anyone that day. No mysterious date. No hidden rendezvous. Further investigation revealed the most chilling of details. Emma's body showed signs of a violent struggle. Multiple stab wounds. Her attempts to fight back were evident in the defensive wounds found on her arms and hands. She had been attacked, brutally. It wasn't just a random killing. Emma had been specifically targeted. Police Chief Inspector Helen Marshall addressed the public, speaking of the crime with a chilling calm. Emma had been assaulted before her death. The place where her body was found was not a random location. Seaview Point was known to locals, frequented by tourists and fishermen. But the area where she was found was secluded, hidden from the casual passerby. It was remote, quiet, and the perfect place for someone to dispose of a body without drawing attention. Forensic analysis confirmed that Emma's body had only been in the water for a short time, no more than 48 hours. The killer had disposed of her body recently, perhaps not long before it was discovered. The evidence was mounting, and the police were closing in. The detectives analyzed surveillance footage from nearby parking lots and traffic cameras. They also spoke with Emma's co-workers, friends, and family members. They wanted to understand the relationships Emma had and figure out what had led up to her death. It became clear that Emma had been a responsible woman, someone who kept in touch with her family and always let them know where she was. Her sudden disappearance had raised alarms, but it wasn't until 2 days passed that anyone took real notice. Simon was brought in for questioning. He was calm, too calm. His odd behavior had started to raise suspicion. As the detectives pressed him, Simon's story began to crumble. The last time he'd seen Emma, he couldn't remember. His answers became more erratic. He demanded a lawyer. His refusal to speak, combined with the mounting evidence against him, led the police to make a stunning move. They arrested Simon Webb. He became the prime suspect in his wife's murder. Investigators had checked Simon's cell phone records, and the results were damning. On the night Emma's body was found, Simon's phone had pinged off a tower near Seaview Point. At the exact time the body was discovered, Simon was in the area. The evidence couldn't be denied. The police also found surveillance footage of a car matching Simon's vehicle leaving the parking lot near the site of the body, hours before the discovery was made. Simon denied everything, claiming it was all a coincidence. But the footage told a different story. On the 27th of April, Simon was formally charged with the murder of Emma Davis. The discovery of her lifeless body, the multiple stab wounds, the signs of a violent struggle, all pointed back to him. The case was sealed. And with it, the chilling mystery of Emma's death began to unfold. The news of Simon's arrest sent shockwaves through the community. How could the man who had once been her closest companion, the one who should have protected her, be the very person who ended her life? The questions remained. What had driven him to this point? And what had really happened that day at Seaview Point? The investigation continued, but the haunting truth was already clear. Simon Webb, once a loving husband, now stood accused of a crime that shattered the peace of so many lives. And as the trial loomed on the horizon, the case of Emma Davis's murder became an unsettling reminder that sometimes, the closest people to us are the ones capable of the darkest acts. The Sutherland family was steeped in secrets, but none darker than the one that lay at the heart of their downfall. Amelia and Thomas had made a pact with the authorities. one that would destroy everything they had ever known. Thomas, the lesser of the two evils, struck a deal. He pled guilty to tampering with evidence, an act that seemed tame compared to the depths of the crime. In 2016, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, a sentence that hung over him like a shadow. His mother, however, was not so lucky. She was condemned to life. No hope of ever stepping foot outside those cold prison walls. A year later, another figure in the twisted tale was sentenced, Victor Hayes, a man who had been tied to the crime by threads of deception. He avoided the death penalty by taking a guilty plea for first-degree murder, a decision that sealed his fate. Life behind bars, no parole. A bitter, unforgiving existence. At the core of the crime, the mastermind, Evelyn Sutherland, was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The woman who had orchestrated it all was now left to live with her choices that had destroyed so many lives, including her own. But the true tragedy lay in the life of Emma Hayes, a young girl caught in the crossfire of a family's destructive greed and bitterness. Emma's father, Samuel, had been her protector, her rock. But now, she was left to navigate a world without him, a world where the people who were supposed to love her the most had been the ones to take him away. As the legal battle over custody of Emma raged on, Samuel's father, Greg Hayes, filed a petition to take custody of his granddaughter. The town around them, a place where church bells rang every Sunday and people waved at each other with fake smiles, was a place where people could kill without remorse. They were the kind of people who could justify murder with a prayer on their lips, all while pretending to care for the girl caught in the middle. The older generation of Sutherlands, those who should have known better, had helped their daughter Evelyn carry out a heinous act. They had aided in the murder of a man who, despite his faults, had loved his daughter with all his heart. Samuel Hayes wasn't a villain. He had been a father trying to build a future for his daughter, trying to do right by her after the collapse of his marriage. He had found love again, with a woman who made him smile in a way he hadn't in years. He had moved on. But Evelyn couldn't let him go. She couldn't bear to see him find happiness after everything they had been through, after the bitter years of their marriage. She couldn't stand the idea of him with someone else. The hatred that burned inside Evelyn wasn't just about custody. It was about the new life Samuel had built, the life he had created without her. It was about the new woman in his life, the one who represented everything Evelyn felt she had lost. And so, she turned her family against him, manipulating them until they believed that killing him was the only way to make things right. They didn't care about Emma. If they had, they would have found a way to solve things without bloodshed. But it wasn't about Emma. It was about revenge. It was about hurting Samuel in the worst way possible. The murder of Samuel Hayes wasn't a random act of violence, it was the culmination of years of bitterness, jealousy, and a desperate need for control. And in the end, the only real loser was Emma. She was the one left to pick up the pieces, to navigate a world where the people who should have protected her had instead torn her life apart. The custody battle dragged on for months, with Greg Hayes fighting tooth and nail to bring his granddaughter into a safe, loving home. But even as he fought, the damage was done. Emma had lost everything she knew. The family who had once cared for her, who had once loved her, had betrayed her in the most unforgivable way. It was hard to believe that the people who had killed her father could ever truly love her. But they had tried to justify their actions, cloaking their evil in the guise of love, claiming they were doing what was best for her. But in the end, it was only about their own egos, their own desires. Far from the chaos of the Sutherland family, a young woman named Sophie had embarked on a journey of her own. Sophie Duval had always dreamed of a life beyond the small town where she grew up. She was driven, intelligent, and full of hope. Born in the quiet countryside of France, Sophie had always been fascinated by the world outside her hometown. She had longed to see the cities of the world, to experience new cultures, and to build a life for herself. At the age of 22, she finally took the leap and moved to the bustling city of Paris to pursue her dream of becoming a professional photographer. Sophie was an adventurous soul. She loved to travel, to explore places few people had ever seen. Her social media was filled with snapshots of her travels, pictures from the streets of Rome, snapshots of the Eiffel Tower, and breathtaking views from mountain peaks. Sophie wasn't afraid to put herself in the heart of the action. She climbed cliffs, hiked through forests, and ventured into the wilderness to capture the beauty of the world through her lens. One of her favorite spots was a quiet coastal town on the outskirts of France, where she often visited for the perfect photo shoot. On a crisp autumn day in 2016, she made her way to the cliffs near the town, ready to capture the stunning scenery at sunrise. As she stood on the edge of the cliffs, the wind in her hair and the salty air filling her lungs, Sophie snapped a photo of the view. She had no idea that this seemingly ordinary moment would be the last time anyone would see her alive. Sophie's body was discovered days later, washed up on the rocks beneath the cliffs, her camera still clutched in her hand. Her death, like so many before her, seemed to be the result of a tragic accident. But as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a different story, a story of betrayal, a story of a young woman whose trust had been shattered by someone she had loved. Sophie's life was stolen from her, not by fate, but by the hands of someone she thought she could trust. Her death, like Emma's, was a reminder that sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who can hurt us the most. Trust, once broken, can never be repaired. And in the end, the ones who are left to pick up the pieces are the ones who never asked to be part of the story in the first place. As the investigation into Sophie's death continued, it became clear that her journey had ended far too soon. Her dreams of capturing the world's beauty through her lens were shattered, just as Emma's dreams of a happy childhood had been torn apart by the violence of her family. Both of their stories ended in tragedy, victims of the selfishness and cruelty of the people who were supposed to protect them. Lena's family was left in a state of disbelief, unable to comprehend the loss of their beloved daughter. Her mother, devastated by the news, rushed to Sydney as soon as she heard. She arrived, hoping to find some explanation, but the reality of her daughter's death struck her like a physical blow. How could her only child, full of dreams and potential, be taken so violently? The grief was unbearable, and no words could make sense of it. Lena, just 25 years old, had gone about her day like any other. On the afternoon of April 21st, she was seen shopping at a mall in the bustling central district of Sydney. She was captured in CCTV footage, alive, smiling, with no sign of the tragedy that was about to unfold. After finishing her errands, she made her way to St. James Station and boarded a train heading towards her home in Erskine Park, a quiet area in the southwest of the city. She had no idea that the train ride would be the last peaceful moment she would ever experience. She arrived home that evening, around 5 p.m., where she lived with her uncle, aunt, and cousin. That would be the last time anyone saw Lena before her life was violently cut short. Darren King, 27 years old, was married to Lena's aunt and had long been a trusted member of the family. However, as the investigation into Lena's disappearance progressed, the dark truth about Darren would come to light. Just a few days after Lena went missing, police uncovered CCTV footage showing a vehicle entering Lake Munmora National Park on the morning of April 24. The body of Lena was believed to be inside that vehicle, hidden from view, discarded as though her life had meant nothing. As investigators dug deeper into the case, they uncovered shocking evidence of Darren's twisted actions. The autopsy on Lena's body revealed that she had fought fiercely for her life. There were numerous defensive wounds, showing that she had attempted to protect herself from her attacker. More than 30 stab wounds were discovered, evidence of a brutal, senseless killing. But the story didn't end there. Darren's phone, seized by police and examined by forensic experts, would reveal even more sinister details. It turned out that Darren had secretly installed a hidden camera in the shared bathroom of the house where he lived with his wife and Lena. The camera had been placed behind toiletry items, and Lena had unknowingly become the subject of his twisted voyeuristic obsession. Darren had regularly watched the recordings of Lena in her most private moments, developing a deep, unhealthy fixation. The contents of his phone were nothing short of chilling. Images and videos of Lena, taken in the hours before her death, were discovered. It became clear that Lena had returned home on the evening of April 21st and had sent her last text message around midnight. After that, her phone went silent, just as she did. What followed was a 2-day nightmare, one that would end in her death. Darren, once again, crept into Lena's room late that night. She was asleep, vulnerable, unaware of the horror that was about to unfold. He had done this before, snuck into her room, taken what he wanted, and left, but this time, Lena woke up. She fought back, screaming and struggling to escape. But Darren was stronger. He quickly subdued her, binding her hands and covering her mouth with duct tape to keep her silent. For the next 2 days, Lena was kept captive in her own home. She was bound, helpless, and terrified. Darren would enter and leave the room, carrying out his cruel, depraved acts with disturbing regularity. The photos on his phone told the story: Lena's naked body, bound and fearful, her face etched with horror. But at this point, she was still alive. By the morning of April 23rd, the nightmare had reached its grim conclusion. Darren, having left the house multiple times during the day, continued his charade. He took showers, went outside to take out the trash, and made sure to erase any trace of the crimes he had committed. The house was scrubbed clean, and any evidence of Lena's captivity was hidden away. Later that day, Darren made his move. At 7 a.m. on April 24th, he left the house and drove to Snapper Point. He stopped at a gas station along the way, buying drinks and filling his car with gasoline, caught on CCTV once again. But it was what he did next that sealed his fate. Upon arriving at Snapper Point, he disposed of Lena's body, casting her lifeless form off the cliffs into the water below. He even took photographs, documenting the end of his twisted plan. After disposing of Lena's body, Darren returned home. He went through the motions of normal life, visiting his parents, talking about nothing in particular, and pretending nothing was wrong. Later, he accompanied his wife to the police station, filing a missing persons report for Lena. He acted as if he, too, was grieving. He played the part of a concerned family member, despite knowing exactly what had happened. The investigation continued to unfold in unexpected ways. By June 29, 2016, Darren's case reached court. His lawyer, speaking on his behalf, argued that Darren was just as shocked by Lena's death as the rest of the family. But Darren, unlike his lawyer, was not present in the courtroom. Instead, he appeared via video link, avoiding the eyes of the family and friends who had gathered to seek justice for Lena. Darren's defense was that he had no memory of the events leading up to Lena's death. He claimed that he had taken illegal drugs, and his memory was foggy. He couldn't recall the 2-hour drive to Snapper Point, where he had thrown Lena's body off the cliff. But the forensic psychologist who examined Darren didn't buy his story. Dr. Richard Evans, an experienced forensic psychologist, testified that Darren was perfectly capable of understanding his actions. The drugs Darren had taken did not cause memory loss, and his actions were calculated, clear and purposeful, not the result of some impaired state. Dr. Evans also refuted Darren's claim that he didn't feel any sexual attraction toward Lena. The hidden cameras, the images, and the disturbing photographs told a very different story. Darren's obsession with his young niece was undeniable. The brutal nature of Lena's murder, more than 30 stab wounds, suggested a level of sadism and control, not a crime of passion. The evidence spoke for itself. Darren had made a chilling mistake in thinking he could erase his crimes. The truth, buried deep beneath his lies and manipulations, had found its way to the surface. And now, justice would find him as well. The courtroom was icy, its silence almost suffocating. Jason Moretti sat there, unmoving, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the judge. His eyes, hollow with something unsettling, reflected little of the chaos he'd caused. His expression was hard to read, too calculated, too rehearsed. Today was not a day for remorse. Jason claimed he couldn't remember. Not the chilling moments when he walked into Elena Turner's bedroom, a place that should have been sacred, a sanctuary. He couldn't recall how he had silently stalked her, how he'd waited for the perfect moment. His mind, he said, had erased the details, blocked them out. He insisted the 48 hours that preceded Elena's death were nothing but a blur, a black void. He attributed it all to drugs, claiming the substances he had consumed had clouded his memory. He couldn't even remember how he had cleaned the blood from her room or discarded her body like trash. Dr. Kenneth Hayes, a forensic psychologist, was quick to counter his claim. With cold precision, he laid out the facts. Jason had gained weight during the time in question, an undeniable contradiction. He was supposed to have been dependent on drugs, yet his body told a different story. A drug addict, Dr. Hayes explained, does not gain weight, especially not at the rate that Jason did. The courtroom fell silent. The judge, Catherine Phillips, leaned forward, her years of experience telling her that something was deeply wrong with Jason's story. "I've been a criminal defense attorney for more than 30 years, Judge Phillips remarked with quiet authority, and I've never met an obese drug addict. Jason Moretti is lying." Jason's attempt at deflecting blame was as transparent as his supposed remorse. He claimed he had been out of control. But there was no sign of the remorse one would expect from someone who had truly committed a heinous act. No shaking hands, no racked sobs, only a face devoid of guilt. Elena's family, who had endured unimaginable pain, sat in the front row. They listened in cold silence as Jason described vague snippets of the night, the argument, blood, his niece's terrified scream. The little girl had witnessed the nightmare, frozen in fear, unable to process what was unfolding before her eyes. Jason's defense fell apart piece by piece. The chilling admissions tumbled from his mouth. He had broken into Elena's room multiple times while she slept, making videos, taking photographs. 19 photos, explicit images, stolen moments, all before he took her life. And yet, Jason still clung to the notion that he was somehow disconnected from his actions, that drugs and memory loss were the only reasons for his monstrous behavior. Judge Phillips, however, was having none of it. She condemned his actions for what they were, cold, sadistic, and intentional. A man in a position of trust, someone who should have protected Elena, had become her nightmare instead. She made it clear that Jason's attempts to evade responsibility, to weave a narrative of memory loss, would not fool anyone. As the sentence was handed down, 30 years, with eligibility for parole in 2047, Jason showed no reaction. No sigh of relief. No sense of defeat. The courtroom was deathly quiet. His face remained impassive. But for Elena's mother, Maria Turner, there was no silence. There was only the overwhelming weight of loss. "Justice is a long road," Maria said later, her voice steady but heavy with grief. "But we will walk it, and we will remember her." She thanked the community, both in the local town and beyond, who had rallied around her family. She thanked the officers who had worked tirelessly, piecing together the fragments of evidence left behind by Jason. But the case did not end there. In fact, it was only the beginning of a new chapter. For years after Elena's death, something happened that no one could have predicted. An elderly woman, caring for her ailing mother, discovered something chilling. In the midst of cleaning, the woman found a USB drive clutched in her mother's trembling hand. At first, she thought little of it. But curiosity got the better of her, and she plugged the device into a computer. What she found inside made her blood run cold. There were videos. Disturbing videos. Images of Elena in the moments before her death, captured with a vile, predatory lens. These were the very images Jason had deleted from his phone, desperately trying to cover his tracks. But the police were able to match them to the files that had been erased. The photos were irrefutable. The haunting memories Jason had thought he could erase from existence had come back to haunt him. The elderly woman had no connection to Jason Moretti. She had no reason to possess such damning evidence. No one could explain how the USB drive had ended up in her hands. But the truth was inescapable. And the truth always finds its way out. New charges were filed against Jason, further piling onto his already lengthy sentence. His lies, his denials, all shattered in the face of the undeniable evidence. There was no escape this time. Elena's memory lived on, not just in the hearts of those who loved her, but across 2 countries. Tributes poured in from the online community in both Canada and abroad, from both Chinese and Canadian citizens alike. Friends, family, and even strangers mourned her, but they also honored her legacy. Her story, tragic, horrifying, and unjust, became a call to action. It underscored the need for society to address the factors that give rise to such crimes. To consider the broken systems, the darkness in people's souls, and the emptiness that leads some to commit unspeakable acts. And most importantly, it served as a stark reminder to cherish each day. To live fully and mindfully, for we can never predict the day we lose someone we love. Just as we can never predict when that moment might come for us. After finishing school, Emily had always dreamed of adventure. A sense of wanderlust had always burned inside her, pushing her to explore faraway places. So, she packed her bags and set off for a year in New Zealand. The year was everything she'd hoped for: fresh landscapes, new faces, and experiences that changed her forever. It was a time of self-discovery, and when she returned home, she did so with a new sense of purpose, ready to tackle whatever life had in store. It was the summer of 2005 when Emily returned to her hometown. At 25, she was eager to embrace her next chapter. She enrolled at university and dove back into work, striving to balance both. It wasn't long before she found herself surrounded by new friends, including a charming young man named Ryan. They met through a mutual friend on a hiking trip in the nearby mountains. The view from the summit was breathtaking, and as the sun dipped behind the peaks, Ryan's smile seemed to shine just as brightly. He was 4 years older than her, but that small age difference barely registered in the excitement that bloomed between them. By early July, their connection had blossomed into a deep, undeniable romance. They spent their days walking through parks, exploring new restaurants, and sharing late-night talks about everything and nothing. The bond between them grew stronger, and Emily found herself wondering if this was the one. She was cautious with her heart, but there was something different about Ryan, something that felt promising. On the afternoon of August 16, Emily took a leisurely stroll through the park with her adoptive mother, Sarah, and their 2 dogs. The air was warm and the sky clear, a perfect day for a walk. As they ambled along the path, Emily couldn't contain her excitement. She was about to get a promotion at work, something she had worked tirelessly toward. She was on the verge of being named senior sales manager, a step that filled her with pride and anticipation. Emily's eyes sparkled as she spoke of her upcoming promotion, her voice light with the joy of knowing her hard work had paid off. Her conversation then turned to Ryan. They had only been dating for a little over a month, but Emily was smitten. She couldn't help but smile as she talked about him. She was optimistic about their future and even expressed her hopes to introduce him to her adoptive parents soon, planning a dinner with them. Later that evening, after their walk, Emily went to meet Ryan for a date. She promised her mother that she wouldn't be late. She had an early start ahead of her for the next day, where her promotion would be finalized. Sarah and Emily exchanged a quick goodbye, and with a kiss on the cheek, Emily set off. That night would be the last time Sarah saw her daughter alive. Ryan and Emily had a wonderful evening. They laughed, talked, and enjoyed each other's company, making the most of the night before they both faced busy days ahead. As midnight approached, Ryan knew it was time to leave. Emily walked him to the back gate of her house, the one that led to the yard. They said their goodbyes with a tender kiss. Ryan promised he would call her when he got home, and she smiled, watching him disappear into the night. Around midnight, Ryan did call, just as promised, but Emily didn't pick up. He didn't think much of it at first, perhaps she had fallen asleep, considering the early morning she had ahead. But when he tried calling again the next morning and still didn't get an answer, he started to feel the first stirrings of panic. He wasn't sure what to think, so he reached out to a mutual acquaintance, someone who worked with Emily at the same company. That's when the truth began to sink in. Emily hadn't shown up for work that day. She hadn't called in sick. Something was terribly wrong. By the time the clock hit late morning on August 17, Ryan had driven to Emily's house, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. He knocked on the door, but no one answered. The house was eerily silent. He called the police and reported her missing, explaining that he had been the last one to see her the night before. After notifying the authorities, Ryan called Sarah to let her know. Sarah and her husband, David, were on their way to play golf with friends when they received the call. They noticed Emily's car still parked in the driveway, but assumed that someone else had driven her or that she had left for some reason. They carried on with their plans, unaware that their world was about to shatter. When they returned later that afternoon, the police were already at their doorstep. Officers were inside, going through the house, and speaking with Ryan. Sarah and David rushed inside, their hearts sinking at the sight of the officers. Ryan appeared shaken, his voice trembling as he explained that he had last seen Emily around midnight. She had kissed him goodbye, and they had parted ways at the back gate. That was the last time he had seen her. As Sarah made her way upstairs, she immediately noticed something strange. Emily's personal belongings, the things she would never leave behind, her purse, keys, cell phone, passport, driver's license, were all neatly placed in her room. There was no sign that Emily had packed, no indication that she was planning to leave. It didn't make sense. In the backyard, things were even stranger. The gate was open but not forced, suggesting that either someone had let Emily's abductor in or that she had left willingly with someone. The grass near the flower bed was trampled, as if there had been a struggle. A single sandal was lying on the ground, along with a pair of cigarettes arranged in a neat line. Emily didn't smoke. Neither did Sarah or David. And Ryan had denied ever using that particular brand of cigarette. The scene painted a chilling picture, one that made the authorities' suspicions grow. Ryan was immediately considered the prime suspect. His behavior was unsettling. He was nervous, his story inconsistent. And he had called the police before even checking with Emily's parents, before anyone had realized she was missing. Police also found traces of Ryan's DNA on Emily's bed, suggesting that the two had been intimate that night. The investigators speculated that perhaps Emily had rejected Ryan's advances, and that he had resorted to force. Then, in an attempt to cover his tracks, he staged her disappearance. They believed that he had ended her life, and now he was trying to make it look like she had simply vanished. When Ryan was brought in for questioning, he was shocked by the accusations. His voice cracked as he swore he would never hurt Emily. He claimed that their evening together had been consensual, that they were happy. He was devastated by her disappearance and insisted that he had no part in anything sinister. Emily's parents couldn't believe what they were hearing. Ryan had always seemed so kind, so gentle. Their daughter had spoken of him in glowing terms. They couldn't imagine that he could be involved in such a tragedy. But the more the police dug, the more it seemed like they had no choice but to look closer at him. Emily's parents knew their daughter. She was responsible. She had been looking forward to her promotion and had no reason to disappear. She wouldn't have left without telling them. She was too thoughtful, too careful for that. The pieces didn't add up. She wasn't the type to run away, especially not with everything she had going for her. There had to be another explanation. But as the investigation deepened, the truth seemed to slip further and further away. Each new discovery raised more questions than answers. Emily's disappearance remains a mystery. The phone calls that went unanswered. The broken promises. And the haunting uncertainty that lingers, as her family waits for the truth to come to light. All they have now is the memory of her smile, the last kiss at the gate, and the chilling possibility that someone they trusted might hold the key to what happened to their beloved daughter. Her belongings were scattered around the house, her phone, her purse, her ID. Everything was in its place except for one thing, Evelyn. Dylan sat in the interrogation room, his eyes hollow, his fingers twitching nervously. He answered each question with surprising calmness, his voice steady despite the storm of questions pouring over him. Yet, there was something about his composure that made the detectives uneasy. Still, they had no evidence, no physical proof to keep him there. After a few hours, they had no choice but to release him. But they didn't let him go entirely. The investigation continued. The search for Evelyn kicked off the day after her disappearance. Law enforcement moved quickly, combing through her home, her yard, the alleyways and streets surrounding her house. Neighbors were interviewed, but no one reported hearing anything unusual. No loud noises. No screams in the night. No strange cars parked in front of the house. The timeline of her disappearance was narrow, sometime between the moment she said goodbye to Dylan and the first light of dawn. A quiet window, the streets empty, the city asleep. Flyers with Evelyn's face and a phone number were printed and posted everywhere, urging anyone with information to come forward. Her story was plastered across every news outlet, splashed on the front pages of newspapers, capturing the attention of the entire town. Hundreds of volunteers showed up to help, desperate to find the missing woman. They searched every nook and cranny, retraced every step Evelyn had ever taken. But the tips were all dead ends. Day after day, the search area expanded. Abandoned houses, hidden trails in the woods, old warehouses. Even the rivers and swamps were scoured, but no clues were found. Not even a scrap of clothing or a single hair. Despite everything, Dylan stayed in the public eye. He joined the search parties, handing out flyers, showing up to the press conferences. He made emotional pleas to the media. He cried on camera, holding up pictures of him and Evelyn smiling together in better days. "Please," he begged, his voice cracking. "If you know anything, I just want her back." But something felt off. The police couldn't ignore the growing suspicion surrounding him. His actions, his words, his desperation, it all felt too rehearsed. And yet, there was no direct evidence linking him to her disappearance. Dylan lived alone, about 8 miles from Evelyn's home, in a small, modest house on the edge of town. After his emotional appeal to the media, he seemed to withdraw. He stopped attending search efforts, stopped talking to the press. The public's suspicion of him only grew stronger. The police didn't let up. They interviewed him 3 more times, hoping to catch him in a lie. But each time, his story remained the same. He told them he had no idea where Evelyn was. He swore he hadn't seen her since she left that night. They pressed him further. A lie detector test was offered. Dylan refused. That was the moment the investigators knew. Something wasn't right. A few weeks later, Dylan's name was in the papers again, but not for Evelyn. This time, it was for a DUI and resisting arrest. He'd been pulled over late at night, driving under the influence, and when the officer tried to arrest him, Dylan fought back. The media quickly picked up on the arrest, speculating that he was trying to drown his guilt in alcohol. Evelyn's parents, on the other hand, spoke up again. They had never met Dylan in person. They knew him only through Evelyn's stories. She had told them that she was happy. She was planning to introduce him to them soon. But now they wondered, had their daughter kept something from them? Were there details she had withheld? The police interviewed Dylan's neighbors. They asked questions like, had they noticed him throwing out large bags of trash? Had they seen him acting suspiciously? Cleaning his car obsessively? But again, nothing turned up. The trail was growing colder by the day. The search continued, but it had lost its urgency. The media moved on. The story of Evelyn's disappearance no longer dominated the news. The search parties had thinned out. The public's interest was fading. But the police weren't giving up. They kept pushing, hoping Dylan would eventually crack under the pressure. And then, just when the case seemed all but forgotten, a strange twist occurred. It was September 20th, 2005. Over a month had passed since Evelyn vanished. A phone call came into the police station, startling the officers on duty. The caller was a man named Thomas Cooper, a local resident. He said he knew where Evelyn was. He claimed he had taken her life. And he knew exactly where her body was. The detectives were stunned. Thomas had never been mentioned during the investigation. He hadn't been a suspect. There had been no reason to even consider him. At first, the police thought he was just a man seeking attention. Maybe he was someone craving notoriety, trying to take credit for one of the most high-profile cases in the area. But when they followed the directions Thomas gave them, they found her. The body was exactly where he said it would be. No one could understand it. How could a man who had never been on their radar, who had never shown up on any investigation logs, suddenly appear and confess to such a heinous crime? The answer wasn't as simple as they had hoped. The truth, as it turned out, was far darker than anyone could have imagined. The police had no idea what they were walking into that day, thinking it was just another cold tip, another stretch of barren land with no real lead. But when they reached the overgrown ravine that Liam Carter had finally pointed them to, their hearts sank. There, hidden beneath layers of brush, was the body. Lifeless, abandoned, and left to rot in the shadows. Liam lived only a stone's throw away from the Roberts family home, technically. His house, which he shared with his reclusive mother, was separated by an unkempt stretch of wild bushes that formed a nearly impassable barrier. From the outside, it seemed as though the two homes were worlds apart. But in reality, they were nearly neighbors, yet their lives had never crossed. Neither Emily nor Liam had ever exchanged a word in their entire lives. Emily had noticed Liam before, of course. A pale, odd man who stayed inside most of the time, only venturing out occasionally to stare blankly at the sky or shuffle aimlessly in his front yard. She thought him strange, maybe a little unwell in the mind. But she never gave it much thought. He was just another quiet neighbor, one who lived in a house that felt as abandoned as he seemed. But Liam had noticed her. He had watched her for a long time. Emily was everything Liam wasn't. Beautiful, confident, and always surrounded by the people he longed to know. She was the perfect embodiment of everything he had been denied in life. From a distance, he watched her, always from behind a window, always hidden in the shadows of his yard. He watched her laugh, talk with friends, kiss her boyfriend. It ignited something dark within him, something he couldn't control. The more he watched, the more it consumed him. As a child, Liam had been isolated from the start. His peers mocked him, teased him endlessly. They called him names. Freak. Weirdo. Outcast. Girls would laugh at him, telling him he was disgusting, that he was invisible to them. He was never a part of their world, never even considered. Even from an early age, the rejection hit him like a physical wound. By the time he was 8, the doctors diagnosed him with a social behavioral disorder, but all the therapy in the world did nothing to repair his shattered self-esteem. He learned to hide behind his walls, retreat into his bedroom, and cut off any chance of a real connection. By his teenage years, the fantasies began. Fantasies of controlling women. Of overpowering them in ways that shook him to the core. Sometimes, they were about Emily. Sometimes, they were about other women he watched from afar. These fantasies were his escape, his way of dealing with the searing rejection and self-loathing. His therapists dismissed them as just thoughts, nothing more. They were wrong. He knew, deep down, they weren't just thoughts. Liam stopped attending therapy once he turned 18. He dropped out of school and became a complete recluse. The world outside no longer mattered to him. His days were spent alone in his room, sitting at his computer, scrolling through adult websites, his only connection to a world that seemed forever out of his reach. Occasionally, he ventured outside, slipping quietly into the shadows of his yard, peeking through the windows of his neighbors' homes. He liked to watch. It filled him with something he couldn't explain, something that mixed anger with longing. Emily was one of the people he watched most. She was so beautiful. So full of life. The kind of woman who didn't even know he existed. That night, the night everything changed, was like any other. Liam had sneaked out, his eyes dark with anticipation. He crawled into the bushes between the houses and watched as Emily's boyfriend, Ryan, arrived at her home. The two of them went inside, laughing, oblivious to the eyes that followed them from just a few feet away. Liam's breath quickened as he watched them, the sick excitement growing with every second. He didn't want to leave. He couldn't. The hours passed, and as midnight approached, he remained hidden in the bushes. Then, finally, Emily and Ryan stepped outside. They kissed by the front gate. It was a brief, tender moment, a normal moment for a young couple in love. But for Liam, it was anything but normal. It felt like a violation. He had been watching them for so long, seeing their intimacy unfold behind closed windows, and now, in front of him, they shared a kiss. He was so close, but so far away. When Ryan finally left, Emily stood alone at the gate, still unaware of the eyes on her. But then, she saw him. Liam. Watching her. Spying on her. The realization hit her hard, and fury replaced the calm on her face. She marched toward him, her voice rising in anger. "You sick pervert. What the hell do you think you're doing? Watching me like that? You're a creep." Her words stung him like a slap. A sharp, humiliating slap that tore through the carefully built walls inside him. She called him a loser. The word echoed in his ears. It was the same word he'd heard from girls in school. The same word that had haunted him for decades. And this time, it shattered something inside him. He wasn't going to take it anymore. Liam lunged forward. His fist slammed into her head with a sickening crunch. She staggered back, but before she could regain her balance, he was on her, pushing her down onto the cold ground. He grabbed her hair, pulling it back, and then his hands wrapped around her throat. He squeezed, feeling the life drain from her. She struggled, her nails digging into his skin, but his grip tightened. But it wasn't enough. Not for Liam. He wasn't done. He pulled back for a moment, letting her body fall limp, then began kicking her. Over and over, his feet slammed into her chest, her ribs cracking under the force. She didn't scream anymore. She couldn't. When he finally stopped, his heart pounding in his ears, Emily lay still. Her body was broken. Her face was unrecognizable. Liam wasn't finished. He dragged her body into his garage, undressed her, and then stood over her. His mind was clouded, filled with a mix of satisfaction and guilt. He couldn't explain it. The shame, the rush. But in that moment, it all came together. He relieved himself. Not a moment of tenderness or humanity, just a cold, disconnected act. When it was over, he moved her body again. This time, into the trunk of his mother's old car. He drove her out of town, down a lonely country road, and dumped her in a ravine, hidden among the trees. For weeks, Liam lived with the fear that someone would find her body. But as time passed, he grew bolder. The body was no longer a secret, it was an inconvenient truth he couldn't bury deep enough. Finally, the guilt crept up too much. He led the police to the ravine where he had left her, showing them where he had hidden his crime. But even then, his story didn't add up. The details were inconsistent, the motives unclear. What had really happened that night? What had made him snap? The investigators would never truly understand what happened behind those walls, what years of torment and rejection had done to a man so broken, so lost in his own darkness. What they did know was this: the quiet, unassuming neighbor was no longer harmless. He had crossed a line that could never be undone. And Emily Roberts, a girl who had once been full of life, would never have the chance to grow, to change, to become anything more than a memory of the man who had decided, in a moment of anger, that she would be his final victim. The trash bags were packed tightly. Inside them were the clothes he had worn, the victim's belongings, and the towels he had used to wipe away the bloodstains. The scene was meticulously cleaned, and the evidence hidden, disposed of like garbage. It was a desperate attempt to erase the horror that had unfolded in the small apartment. It wasn't until April of 2007 that the details of the case came to light, shockingly public in a courtroom where the truth began to unfold piece by piece. The defendant, a man named Benjamin Cole, sat there, his eyes glazed, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't deny what had happened. In fact, he confessed. He had killed his neighbor, Sarah Martin, he said. But as he spoke, he insisted that it wasn't murder, it was an accident. He hadn't meant to take her life. It had been a spur-of-the-moment thing, a tragic mistake. His lawyer backed him up, claiming that Benjamin was suffering from severe mental illness. They argued that he didn't understand the consequences of his actions, that he should be treated, not imprisoned. The defense team fought desperately for a lighter sentence. They said Benjamin wasn't fully responsible for what had happened. He was mentally unstable, they claimed. They wanted him placed in a psychiatric facility, not a prison cell. But the prosecution stood firm, their stance unwavering. They painted a darker picture, a man with anger issues, someone who had deliberately hurt Sarah. The rage in his actions wasn't a mistake. He had beaten her senseless, knowing what the outcome would be. It was no accident. Despite Benjamin's claims of mental illness, the court found the evidence overwhelming. He had kicked Sarah repeatedly, with such force, each blow more violent than the last. He knew the consequences of his actions. His anger was evident in every strike, in every moment he ignored her pain. There was no question. He was aware. He had intended for her to die. As the trial progressed, experts were brought in to evaluate Benjamin's state of mind. Could he be considered insane? Was he truly unaware of the consequences of his actions? After careful evaluation, the psychiatrists concluded that, despite his anger issues, Benjamin was fully responsible for his actions. He had understood the severity of what he did. The court agreed, and the verdict was sealed. But the case didn't end there. The investigators discovered something chilling in the backyard of Benjamin's home, something that would haunt the investigation forever. Beneath the overgrown grass, items were found, carefully arranged in a straight line. Personal belongings, items Sarah had owned, her keys, her phone, her favorite scarf, arranged with unsettling precision. Benjamin never admitted to placing them there, but the evidence suggested otherwise. It was as if he had staged a scene, carefully hiding his connection to what had transpired. Then, on May 7, 2007, the gavel fell. Benjamin Cole was found guilty of second-degree murder. The court sentenced him to life in prison, but with the possibility of parole after 16 years. It was a sentence that brought some semblance of closure to the community, though no one could truly erase the horror of what had been done. Yet Sarah's story didn't end there. Her life, her voice, was taken from her too soon. But in 2008, a talented songwriter named Emily Rose, hailing from Canada, found a way to immortalize Sarah's memory. Emily wrote a haunting song called Shattered Echoes, which depicted the final moments of Sarah's life. Through the lyrics, Sarah's voice was brought back to life, a chilling, poignant reminder of the woman who had been lost to violence. Now, let me take the story of Laura Wallen and transform it into something similar, changing names, adding depth, and keeping the emotional intensity throughout. I'll make it long, gripping, and full of suspense. Would you like that?